Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing very, very well. I've got a fabulous story for you tonight, so before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And also, don't forget to get that quintessential drink, because whatever it is that you drink, I want to know about it. So keep the comments coming. So let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it happened a long time ago, about 37 years ago to be exact. But even when I think about the event, it most certainly makes my skin crawl, sending unpleasant chills down the spine, as it could so easily have cast my character in a negative, less than favourable light, which would ultimately have had catastrophic consequences on my career. It would seem that the age-old adage that no good deed goes unpunished is very apt in this case. Since I was about 9 years old, I have always known what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted nothing more than to become a sheriff in a small American town. In my early youth, most of the games I played with my younger brother Benjamin were cops and robbers. I invariably assumed the role of the cop, while my brother, along with our friends, became the iniquitous gang of robbers that I arrested. I remember I owned a mesmerising, shimmering sheriff badge, along with a pair of handcuffs and, of course, the quintessential cowboy hat that any sheriff would be proud to have gracing his head. I do recall it gave me a buzz arresting my brother's friends in all our boyhood games. This profound revelation that made me desirous to become a sheriff occurred to me when our next-door neighbour, a very pretty young woman in her early 20s called Abigail Cordell, was beaten black and blue by her goon of a boyfriend on a regular basis. It was not uncommon to see her walking around with a limp in one of her legs or a cast on her forearm from a broken wrist. Of course, she would feign that she had just bumped into a door, but no one was ever fooled, not even for a fleeting second. We lived in a close-knit neighbourhood, where all the bungalows were so close to each other that you could almost hear the neighbour breathe. It was unfortunate that the walls in the houses seemed so paper-thin that even my mother would describe us as pretty much living in a goldfish bowl. So regretfully everybody knew each other's business. To all intents and purposes, privacy was indeed a luxury that we could ill afford, rather like an expensive crocodile bag you could only ever dream of owning. I regret that gossip was rife in our community. Tongues were forever wagging, especially about the young couple living next door to us, who were always being discussed by the locals in every diner, coffee shop and street corner in our local town. Indeed, sometimes we could hear a woman's frantic sobs from the next-door neighbour's house, along with a man's raised, rather gravelly voice that could be heard for miles around. All the houses in our area would become unusually quiet and unnaturally still, almost as if every ear in the neighbourhood was listening in. It didn't take much to deduce that this woman was a victim of domestic violence. Of course, whenever the police were called around to the property by a concerned neighbour, Abigail simply refused to press any charges against her intemperate boyfriend. My mother would always shake her head in despair. Her eyes would mist over with tears. "Poor, poor woman! I wish we could do something to help the poor mite." Even though I was only a boy at the time, I wanted nothing better than to break down the neighbour's front door and punch the lights out of that dreadful, impetuous, hot-headed man who was a Class A, unsavoury, homicidal thug. I remember when my mother was not looking, I would surreptitiously go around to the neighbour's house. I would knock on the door, when I knew, of course, that the young lady's pugnacious boyfriend was definitely out. I always knew when he'd left the premises, because I'd hear his motorbike starting up, whizzing down the street, disappearing down the long ribbon of asphalt, until finally there was a blissful silence, along with a feeling of tranquillity, once, of course, the rabid man had finally left the neighbourhood. I'm sure I wasn't the only person to be heartily relieved to see him go. The bad news was he was always back like an annoying mosquito that never leaves you alone. I was about 9 years old at the time. I remember Abby would open the bright red front door. Her eyes would be black and blue as a result of another vicious assault from her boyfriend. She would look down at me and say, "Yes, can I help you?" I'd hand her a piece of cake that my mother had made. "It's for you. It's chocolate fudge," I told her. "Mum says that ladies love chocolate." "Your mother is very clever." "She's right," I love chocolate. This is very sweet of you. So very kind. Would you like to come in for an ice-cold lemonade? I remember nodding while she led me into her kitchen that was always strewn with pizza and burger boxes, along with copious amounts of crunched-up beer cans. Does it hurt? I asked her, looking at her black eye as she watched me drink my icy lemonade. I remember thinking she looked so sad, seemed very glad of my company, for even at the young tender age I could sense the troubled woman was indeed desperately lonely. She had nodded. Well, it's a little tender. It hurts a bit, I suppose, but it's not that bad. Why does he hit you, your boyfriend? I asked. We can hear you crying all the time. Why is he so mean to you? My dad is never mean to my mother. I guess my boyfriend just has a bad temper. He gets upset with me sometimes. I suppose I wind him up the wrong way. Then he just explodes. That's no excuse. Your boyfriend's bad. If I was big, I'd beat him up for you, so he could never ever hurt you again. I remember she'd laughed. You are clever, sweet, very kind, she said. Quite the charmer. What's your name? Nicholas Stuart Forbes, I told her. That's a cool name, Nicholas. What do you want to do when you grow up? Then it hit me like a blinding revelation, as if a bright light in a dark corner of my mind had uncovered a marvellous hidden golden truth, rather like an old book hiding in a corner covered in cobwebs that held this big, fabulous, mind-blowing secret that only in this second of time had just suddenly revealed itself to me. A policeman, I told her proudly. I want to be a policeman, maybe a sheriff, so I can arrest horrible men like your boyfriend, so he can never ever hurt you again. I would lock him up, never let him out, so that you would be safe and happy forever and ever. That would be very nice, she said dreamily. Sometimes I wish someone would lock him up, throw away the key. Yet I do love him, you know, in a twisted way. But he does have a dark side. When he gets angry, he just loses it. My mum thinks you should leave him. Your mum has a lot of opinions about my relationship, it would seem. Well, we can hear you arguing all the time. He's very, very loud. Well, your mother's right, I guess. I should leave him, but I can't. I'm torn between a rock and a hard place because despite everything, I still love him. I remember being very confused that this pretty girl could love such an odious, obnoxious man, but I was soon to learn that as I grew up, human relationships could be very complicated. Suffice to say, I truly regret that I never knew what actually happened to Abby Cordell, as they moved away from their home next to us, so I never saw her again. I always hoped she came to her senses one day, and finally left that creep, as nobody deserves to live in fear over their partner, walking on landmines every day of their lives, terrified that one day one of them might just explode. Fast forward to when I was about 25 years old. At this quintessential stage of my life, I had a bachelor's degree behind me in criminal law, and was eager to pursue the route of becoming a bona fide, fully fledged sheriff, but it would at first require some practical applications, like becoming an intern in a sheriff's office for a while, to gain some life experience that was invaluable for me. I was mulling over these considerations in my mind while deciding to take a trip to the North Cascades National Park, which is only about 3 hours' drive away from Seattle, where I lived at the time. This North Cascades Park is an exquisite park, long revered for its rugged beauty, alpine meadows, jagged peaks, deep forested valleys, majestic mountain scenery, cascading waterfalls, snowfields, and of course stunning glaciers. Indeed, the national park has only 300 glaciers, which is much more than any United States national park outside of Alaska. It is one of the least visited national parks. I've always preferred to evade the crowds, so the North Cascades Park ticked all the boxes for me. I had firmly decided to take the highway loop leading to Winthrop, from where I chose to enjoy a few hiking trails veering quite a way off the beaten track. One of the things you do have to consider as a potential sheriff or police officer is being physically fit. This was something I took very seriously indeed. so hiking for hours over tumultuous terrain only added to my strength, stamina, and endurance skills. So on this particular occasion, I was eager to pursue a really rather challenging route that was not on any designated hiking trail, that required a great deal of uphill trekking in a remote area of the park. So off I went like a lamb to the slaughter, as unbeknownst to me, this day would be unlike any other, and would leave an indelible blueprint on my life. I do remember it was an exquisite spring morning. The winter was long behind us. The meadows were bursting with colourful blooms. There were alpine flowers in the valley, of every colour, in pinks, blues, yellows and whites. There were colourful butterflies darting from one flower to another, along with wild bees frenziedly pollinating all the flowers. It looked so beguiling, so breathtaking, so magnificently beautiful. I decided to take a trek through the wooded, undisturbed area that was rarely frequented by visitors to the park, filled with clusters of Douglas firs, western hemlocks and red cedar trees. There are no words to describe this wooded sanctuary to you. It was absolutely mesmerizing. The tall, graceful, pyramid-shaped trees towered up into the sky like emerald giants, while the dark earthen floor was richly carpeted with viridescent greens, including interesting ground covers from ferns to succulent herbs, salvias, wild strawberries, lilacs, a kaleidoscope of rich indigenous plants, along with several collapsed tree trunks lying across the forest floor, swathed elegantly in luxuriant green mosses, lichens and lots of fungi, many of them clearly edible. Soft shafts of sunlight twinkled through the little openings between the trees, dappling the forest floor in a flattering, gentle light that served to highlight the intense, rich, vibrant greens of this ethereal, shaded sanctuary. As I was walking through the wooded area, I was suddenly struck by how quiet everything was. You see, I've been a hiker all my life. Never have I known the forest to be this silent, as all the cheerful birdsong was absent from the space. So all I could hear were my rubber-soled boots crunching the twigs, leaves and ground covers beneath my feet. I will say that I did find the silence really rather intimidating, disturbing even. I was profoundly bothered by it all. I sensed something was definitely amiss, but what I couldn't even imagine. This anomalous, outlandish feeling certainly set my nerves on edge. I knew all too well the full implications of an area growing quiet often meant that there may be a predator in my midst. But what? A mountain lion? Cougar? A bear? I couldn't be sure. My nerves intensified, while a little voice in my head told me to leave the forest at once and return to the common hiking trail regularly traversed by other hikers. All of a sudden I picked up two distinct voices, one sounding like a little girl whose musical laughter filled the forest with a joyful resonance, while the other voice sounded distinctly female. I remember thinking, what the heck is someone doing bringing a toddler into a treacherous, precipitous area like this? I mean, even a relatively fit person would have found this route that I'd taken to be arduous and unfriendly, so hearing the rise and fall of a little child's happy chuckling certainly got my attention. I decided to be very discreet. I approached the voices stealthily, rather like a leopard on the prowl, creeping cautiously behind trees and ground covers. I tried my level best to be as quiet as I possibly could, and that was no mean feat, especially with no birdsong around. I was rarely battling to remain still. When the voices got very close, I lowered my body close to the ground and peered through the rambling foliage to see a massive, towering creature holding hands with a little 6-year-old girl. My heart almost jumped into my throat. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. It was a Bigfoot. Until this life-changing revelatory moment, I had relegated this mythical creature to the realms of fanciful fairy tales and elaborated legends that bordered on the insanely bizarre. It's amazing how it hits you hard like a block of ice on the head when you suddenly realise that the world is not all that it seems. I should have been absolutely terrified by this imposing creature, but my concerns were directed towards the little child and not myself. I was pretty much convinced she must have been abducted by the creature. Well, so it seemed at the time. Surely no parent would bring a kid into this treacherous part of the wilderness, or they would need their head examining. I pulled out my binoculars to focus in on the Bigfoot and, of course, the little child. What I saw was incredibly endearing. The Bigfoot was female. I guess you could say she was in the region of 7.5 to 8 foot tall, with a pointed head, overlong arms, and a very athletic svelte body. I discerned that she was about 500 pounds, maybe more, and she was muscular, with absolutely no fat on her at all. Even her breast tissue lacked any padding, as her breasts were rather like empty pockets, low slung on her chest. Her body was covered in long flowing golden brown hair that was silky, luxurious, long. Her face was a very dark brown colour, but not completely black, with a flat aquatic nose, deep-set dark eyes, a furrowed forehead, and a female face that looked remarkably human. The creature was talking intently to the child in an audible language of which I am not acquainted with. The little child appeared to be chuckling, while the Bigfoot female was looking at this child with adoring eyes like a besotted mother. The child seemed hilariously happy, certainly thriving on being the centre of attention, chatting away to the Bigfoot without any inhibitions, as if she was having a tea party with her dolls, of which the Bigfoot was clearly one of the guests. This was a kid that was thoroughly enjoying herself, playing like an imaginary game, of which Bigfoot herself was playing a quintessential part. At one point they were both sharing wild strawberries together. The little girl had red stains over her dress from all the juices. I think the thing that hit me hardest was how she related to that kid so naturally, much better than some mothers I've seen before, who are so often very disconnected, cold and indifferent towards their own children. I really didn't want to interrupt this cosy interaction between a child and a Bigfoot, but I knew that I must. I realised that there was a mother out there, possibly worrying herself half to death about the whereabouts of her little daughter. I didn't feel any fear towards this female Bigfoot whatsoever, even though she was utterly enormous, for I perceived she had a heart, and a big one at that. I had witnessed her remarkable, unlikely connection with this human girl, which had been a pleasure to witness, an indelible, tear-jerking memory on my mind that could never ever be expunged. So I just made my appearance known. The female Bigfoot, on seeing me, tightened. Her whole body stiffened. Her dark eyes grew wide with terror, scanning me quickly. I realised she was looking at me to see if I was carrying a weapon of any kind. She reluctantly pushed the little girl towards me. Then she turned around, gliding away into the depths of the forest, and was gone from sight. I was struck by how graceful her movements were. When the female Bigfoot left, the small child began to become very distressed. She didn't like the fact that her friend had gone and that she was stuck with me. She made that clear when she began to sob. Eventually I managed to calm her down, carrying her a long way in my arms down a long trail towards the nearest campground, where my truck was also fortunately parked. I was looking for a park ranger when very suddenly a large, well-upholstered woman came bolting towards me. She grabbed the child from my arms with a look of extreme indignation on her face. Cradling her child in her arms, she cried, "Gretchen! Gretchen! Are you all right? Did this man take you?" He took me away from my tea party." "I knew it," said the woman. "I knew it." She began slapping me hard on the face with her cold hands. Her hazel eyes were like daggers. She began to scream blue murder at me. "You nasty, nasty man! You abducted my kid! How dare you! Perverts like you want locking up!" She grabbed her daughter protectively, looking at me with enraged, furious eyes. "Everyone is out there looking for my daughter. You stole her away. She's been missing for 1.5 hours now. How could you? I've been beside myself with worry. If my husband was here, he'd kill you himself." "Calm down, madam. Calm down. I'd like to explain. You've got it all wrong. You've got the wrong end of the stick. I didn't abduct your daughter. I was the one that discovered her in the woods, way off the hiking trail. I decided to bring her back here, in case anyone knew who she belonged to. I thought better of telling her about the Bigfoot. I knew that would make me seem less credible." "Gretchen, did this man take you from the campground? He did, didn't he? He took you." Gretchen nodded. "Mammy took me away from my tea party." "I'm going to call the park ranger. You need locking up. You and men like you. You make my stomach turn."
I'm not going to listen to this, madam. You're completely off your head. Use your brains, woman. If I was abducting your daughter, I think I'd hardly be carrying her out in broad daylight into your campground, would I? If my intentions were to abduct her, would I have not been a little bit more discreet, don't you think? You knew everyone was looking for my daughter. You knew it. And you thought you'd sneak this way and no one would see you, but you got caught out. That's what happened. Thoughts of my career as a sheriff went flying through the window, like wisps of smoke up a chimney, creating in my mind wavering clouds of uncertainty and doubt. Supposing this woman managed to convince the ranger, or even law enforcement, that I was a person of possible interest in the mysterious short disappearance of her daughter, it wouldn't bode well for my career, as even if there was a lingering questionable doubt over my character, I could kiss goodbye to a career in the force or ever becoming a sheriff. So I just hightailed it out of the place as fast as I could, with the woman screaming obscenities after me. I'll get you! I'll get you! Just you wait! She really was rather unhinged. I don't blame her for panicking about her daughter vanishing like that, but to blatantly accuse me of abducting her daughter without hearing me out was nonsensical, ludicrous, and absolutely ridiculous. I dived into my truck, jumped onto the seat, slammed the car door behind me, revved up the engine, and drove all the way back to Seattle, feeling incredibly rattled, drained, and exceedingly upset about what had just transpired. I realised my actions might have made me look guilty, but really I didn't want to hang around being interrogated by the park ranger, and goodness knows who else, and also having to plead my innocence. It was possible that they would believe my account and realise the woman was as nutty as a fruitcake, but I didn't want to hang around to find out or take any chances. I'd come to the park, for goodness sake, to have a pleasant hike. The fact that I'd stumbled across a young child with a Bigfoot was hardly my fault. I remember phoning my father to tell him exactly what happened. You saw a Bigfoot? He piped. You saw a Bigfoot? Yes, Dad. I saw a Bigfoot. You saw a Bigfoot? Dad, I told you. I saw a Bigfoot. Sorry, son. I'm trying to process what you're saying. Are you sure? Could you not have been mistaken? I saw a Bigfoot, Dad. So the Bigfoot was playing with a little girl in the woods, and you brought her back to the campsite, and an unreasonable woman accused you of abducting her child. I've never heard anything so insanely ridiculous. My father started laughing. What was she smoking, son? Dad, I'm being serious. This isn't funny. I was worried this event would jeopardize my career in becoming a sheriff. Son, I don't mean to laugh, but it is very funny. You are squeaky clean. No one would believe in a month of Sundays you were capable of abducting a child. I can assure you of that. Well, don't you think I made myself look guilty, Dad, running off like that? I'd have run away too if I was wearing your shoes, confronted by a loathsome, ignoramus woman like that. What an appalling woman! For goodness sake, you rescued her daughter. She falsely accuses you of abducting the child. The saying, no good deed goes unpunished, springs to mind here. Just forget about the whole thing, son. Get on with your life. Put it behind you. Forget about it. I would if I was in your shoes.
Fast forward about 5 years. At the time I was an intern to a sheriff in a small town. The job of an intern in a sheriff's office can be tediously dull, doing low-level clerical administrative work, sorting out files, answering phones, you know, that sort of stuff. The sheriff I worked with was a man who saw me as having the quintessential traits to become a town sheriff in the future, and he was desirous for me to fill his shoes one day. But as sheriffs are often elected, he decided to take me out with him on many of his duties so that I became acquainted with the locals, as he wanted to introduce them to me, so that the chances of my being elected as sheriff in the future would become increasingly likely. We soon became firm friends. I told him about my experience in the national park with the Bigfoot, and about the appalling woman that had practically accused me of abducting her child, which the sheriff, much like my father, found terribly amusing. Of course, he thought I was the last person he could ever envisage abducting a child. Much like my father, he only ever saw the funny side of the story. "Poor child," he said. "No wonder she had a tantrum when you took her back to her mother. She would have sooner stayed with the Bigfoot. Honestly, I don't think I can blame her." "You know," I said, "I think that might just be true." At that, we both laughed. One day I was shopping for groceries in the small town, putting items in my trolley. I could see this large woman looking at me, who seemed strangely familiar, although I couldn't perceive where I'd seen her before. This rude, obtrusive woman continued to stare at me fixedly. She was exceedingly obnoxious. Then she shouted at the top of her lungs, as if I'd assaulted her in the middle of the street. "It's you! It's you! You're the horrible man that abducted my little girl 5 years ago! At the Cascades Park in Washington. I knew it was you the moment I saw you. I never forget a face. You haven't changed at all. I knew you were guilty, especially after you ran off like that." All of a sudden I recognised the woman. My heart jumped in my throat. I felt as if all the air had been sucked and drained out of my lungs. I felt as if I was about to hyperventilate from seeing this terrifying, loud, abrasive, uncouth woman all over again. Could it get worse than this? I composed myself, took a deep breath and said, "You get me wrong, madam. I didn't run away because I was guilty, but because you were throwing all kinds of false allegations at me that were not true. I was the one that rescued your little daughter. But did I get any thanks from you? No. On the contrary, you jumped to all kinds of crazy, outlandish conclusions. Most women would have been over the moon to have their daughter back, given the benefit of the doubt to me. But not you. I wasn't going to stick around to have my character assassinated like that, nor my name dragged through the mud. Are you crazy?" "Is everything all right here?" asked the security guard, realising that 2 people in the store were having an altercation, while nosy customers were surreptitiously pretending to shop for items close by, sneakily glancing over their shoulders while acting as if they were reading the ingredients in a box of cereal that had suddenly become incredibly fascinating. Curiosity was intensified, as many of the shoppers were well acquainted with me through the sheriff. "Does everything look all right?" "No, everything is not all right. As it happens," said the woman, waggling her accusatory finger at me like a dagger, "this man here, he abducted my child from the national park 5 years ago. You must arrest him now." "Madam, I cannot arrest this man. I know nothing about the incident of which you speak, but you cannot go randomly accusing someone in the store of something without any proof. We sell groceries here, madam. We're not involved in high-end police investigations. If you have any issues, you need to take them up yourself with the sheriff. People are here shopping, madam. I would kindly appreciate if you lowered the tone of your voice and did not cause a scene or commotion, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store." "How dare you?" said the seething woman, turning her wrath on the security officer and oscillating her arms around furiously like a frenzied octopus. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like this? Why are you standing up for a child abductor? That's what I want to know. It leaves me questioning your integrity. If you want proof, I have proof. I don't forget a face. It's him. I know it's him. He abducted my child. You must call the sheriff at once." By this time, many of the shoppers in the store were not even pretending to shop anymore. They had gathered around us in a large semicircle, watching the scene unfold before them, with such astonishment that their mouths were quite literally hanging open. I think all they needed to do was order some popcorn, dim the lights, then they would have enjoyed the movie. I could only imagine what they would have said when they got home to their families. They were probably gossiping about our altercation for weeks afterwards, because, believe me, it was a scene that would make Universal Studios seriously intimidated. "You want me to call the sheriff, do you?" I asked. "I'll do that for you, before you have any more kittens." "Right, you do that," she said. "You call the sheriff." When the sheriff arrived, the woman began her accusations all over again. Only she raised her voice so loudly that everyone in the store was informed that I had abducted her child in a national park.
Madam, you need to be exceedingly careful when you lay false, slanderous, defamatory accusations at people, said the sheriff. I want to assure you, madam, that this man you are pointing a finger at is likely to fill my shoes one day and become our town sheriff. Let me assure you, madam, that he is not a person that would ever abduct a child. Believe me, I know. In fact, I was well informed about this bizarre story, how my colleague rescued your child from a benevolent female Bigfoot. He then brought her to the campground looking for a ranger. You pounced on him, accusing him of abducting your daughter, but he was the person that rescued your child. I think you owe my intern a very big apology, don't you?
This time the woman looked astonished.
You say my daughter was snatched by a Bigfoot? That is what happened, I told her. Your daughter loved the Bigfoot. She wasn't happy with me retrieving her from the forest. I figured out there had to be an upset mother who was looking for her child, which was why I returned her to the campground. No wonder my daughter kept talking about a nice bear lady after the abduction. It makes so much sense now. You owe the man an apology, came a woman's voice. You should be ashamed of yourself, accusing that man. He's a hero. He's not an abductor. Everyone started clapping, and the woman, who was now so humiliated, said, I'm sorry, but you didn't explain yourself well. You didn't give the man a chance, said one of the shoppers. Believe me, lady, if I'd been in his shoes, I'd also have run a mile from you. Honestly, what the heck is your problem?
I am glad to say I never heard from that woman ever again, but I was to discover that her presence in our small town had been as random as the rain on a sunny day. She had been visiting her sister for a couple of days, who lived in the town, and so happened to be buying a few groceries, when she happened to notice me. I ask you, what were the chances of that ever happening? Which goes to show you that it's a very small world indeed. I'm glad to say I did end up becoming the town sheriff. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.